systemized. So I'm not sure what their ability is to have volunteers. That there may be legal or other issues.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for the things I was, programs I was with, further down, you would never use volunteers. I did a lot of volunteers.
Yeah.
And getting
Well,
people to
of course, contracting is going to be a very sticky point for them going forward. I didn't, that didn't seem to be a realistic possibility.
For my last few months at well, I mean, from January 20th on, we were like sitting around like tooling our guns and basically hearing like, it was like we were always on call. I was receiving my own salary until overtime.
Well, it was the time you worked.
Yeah. And then I got like 6 days. So I took out right in 2 months.
Yeah.
Can we hear her soon?
My camera just went out. Did that turn on?
Yeah. I understand.
There's a combination of
Can you?
On the research side and doing TNR stuff. Policy and advocacy. They retained. They let some.
Okay, we should be. Yeah, we should be fine.
Yeah, I don't.
Hi, Basma. Welcome. We're just dealing with some technical stuff, but we'll be up and ready soon.
Auto shut off that I
It's hard living trying to handle your way into a decent space. I work on had like 30 courses a semester at Johns Hopkins.
I'm talking with somebody about teaching. They want me to teach the master's course in It went really well, and I loved it. And I loved my students. I loved them. And I probably accomplished my students. I was like, the second I read the first chapter, I was like, okay, like, there's some work here, but like, we should try to get you published.
This is published.
Yeah, this is publishable, and this will be a very good thing to come out of your right? But it went well, and then talking with somebody in the music school, and it's like, this is just me trying to piece together contract work properly. Well, I found out about an academic editing contract. That might actually be someone.
There's so many schools now education outposts, and it's something I've always meant to look into, and I never really did. And over here, and yeah, you drive around and you look at the number of places, and I've always thought that, there must be some way to stitch something together, with all of the number of those schools be greater than some cost. Just adjunct in your way, it's too much. It's too much work for too much money.
I know right now that if I do this contract course, like it'll be more work than
Oh, way more. Way more.
incredibly more.
No, totally right. Yeah, totally right. And they're not self-reliant. They need to handle.
The master's course was easy in some ways. I was reading a lot of stuff. It was a new route in a way, but also and I was like, I got a lot of you as a student. I'm going to ask the same kinds of questions to start discussion on that. And you have to
The thing that I've always thought that someone could do, and I never frankly need it badly enough to go forward is all of these schools, they want to get their kids interviews. They want them to go to meetings. They want them to meet people from the executive branch. They want them to meet, some Beltway bandit. And all of them basically have to organize this stuff on their own. And the opportunity is that someone who has, decent experience can come along and say, organize programs for you, and for you, and for you, and for you. And of course, it's all the same stuff. So you don't, it's the same kind of thing, And frankly, they're not generally terribly fussy about precisely which legislative office, precisely which staff. They want DC experience. They want contacts for information, etc. And so there's tremendous inefficiency in the whole finding. So there is the kind of a business opportunity there. If you can get one or two of them, then you could sell it to the others. And A&M is already doing this through one of the Florida, Michigan, sign up. And if you've been in DC for as long as you have, getting these kind of meetings, most congressional.
Yeah, I'll take some photos. Yeah.
Because that's part of the job. Think they all say yes, but it's part of the job. The executive branch is a little harder, but generally you can find someone. The Beltway bandit firms, you can always find the GR office that's and they're always looking for people to hire. So it's not really as difficult as people might sort of think it would be. DC is a town where meetings are once a week. So everyone's primed to say yes.
I'm trying to figure out.
Well, there's my business idea for you. You just got to get one or two places. And the way to do it, I think, is to go after someone who's coming to DC. Don't go after one of these established places. Get a newcomer or two or more.
All right, if everyone can start finding their seats, please. And we're going to get started in just a moment.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we're good. All right. Just find my seats.
Okay. Apologies for that. Should be good now.
All right, everyone. Welcome. I want to welcome you all to this event hosted by the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy on assessing America's role in countering transnational repression and Interpol abuse. My name is Charles Walsh. I'm an analyst here at New Lines, where I lead the transnational repression portfolio. I'm going to be moderating what looks to be a very important and timely conversation about the U.S.'s leadership when it comes to the global fight against transnational repression. So a little bit about the Institute here, or about the initiative here. We recently published 2 landmark reports on transnational repression, otherwise known as TNR. The first report was titled, What the U.S. Can Do to Address Transnational Repression Within Its Borders. It's an extensive review of U.S. policy towards TNR up to this point, its successes and its inadequacies, as well as what the United States needs to do domestically and internationally to counter transnational repression more effectively. The second report was titled How the Abuse of Interpol Contributes to Transnational Repression, and it focuses in on how authoritarian states misuse Interpol's systems and processes to commit transnational repression, and how democratic countries like the United States can put a stop to it. Turning to our panelists here, I'm joined on stage by Dr. Ted Bromund, who is the primary author of both of our reports, as well as being the principal and founder of Bromund Expert Witnesses LLC, and he's one of the foremost experts on Interpol in the United States. We are joined online by Basma Mostafa, an exiled Egyptian investigative journalist and human rights advocate living in Germany, where she helped found the Law and Democracy Support Foundation. Finally, we have Dr. Elise Anderson here on the stage. She's currently a non-resident senior fellow here at New Lines. She previously worked on TNR at Freedom House and has extensive experience working on Uyghur issues. With that, I want to give our panelists some opportunity to provide some opening statements. We're going to start with Ted, move on to Basma, and end with Elise. So that being said, Ted, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to be here at New Lines. I want to thank the New Lines Institute. I would like to thank Azim Ibrahim, who's unfortunately not here today. I'd like to thank Charles and Elise for their stewardship of my paper on Interpol, and with my co-authors Sandra Grossman and Bradley Jardine, our paper on transnational repression. There's been, I think, always a shortage of focus and willing hands in this policy area, and I really fear that the shortage was going to become even more serious, and I'm very glad to see New Lines taking up the slack in this important area. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about Interpol abuse primarily, and then in the Q&A and discussion we can extend that perhaps to TNR. Interpol abuse, what does it mean? When I say Interpol abuse, I mean the use of Interpol to pursue people who are not criminals for corrupt or for political reasons. That's fundamentally what Interpol's abuse is about. Interpol is supposed to pursue people who are what are called ordinary law criminals, people who commit offenses like murder, rape, arson, offenses that are recognized in every country around the world. Interpol abuse is a significant contributor to transnational repression. Unfortunately, we don't know precisely how significant. That's partly because a lot of TNR goes unreported, but it's also because we don't know precisely how much Interpol abuse there is. But as I say in my report, it's safe to say that there's a lot more abuse than Interpol admits that there is. Now, why don't we know how much Interpol abuse there is? Well, it's not because Interpol doesn't publish any data on this question. Interpol does publish some data, and the data that it publishes is reasonably good, although it should be better, and Interpol itself is reasonably open, although I think it should be more open and more transparent, but it's really not, as far as international organizations go, an untransparent or an unresponsive institution. The problem is a little more fundamental. Interpol says, if you ask it, that only about 5% of its publications, particularly Interpol's famous Red Notice, which was the subject of a genuinely terrible movie on Netflix, I believe it was, with The Rock and Wonder Woman and Ryan Reynolds, none of whom can act worth a darn, and the movie was dreadful too. So when I say, I'm just going to say red notices from now on, but it's a little broader than just red notices. Interpol says that about 5% of red notices are abusive. The problem is that only a relatively small percentage of red notices get the highest level of scrutiny from an Interpol body called the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files, the CCF, which you can kind of think of as Interpol's appellate body. If all of Interpol's red notices got that highest level of scrutiny, we would find that more than 5% of them are abusive, although we don't know what percentage we would find, but it would certainly be more than 5%. Why is there Interpol abuse at all? Again, and when my friends at Interpol watch this, hello, I want to make it clear that it's not because Interpol is a bad organization full of bad people who are careless or deliberately abusive. I wish the problem were that simple, but it's really not. The problem is really twofold. First, Interpol has a lot of autocratic member nations, and when you have autocratic member nations, you're liable to have a significant abuse problem. Essentially, every nation in the world, with the exception of Kosovo and North Korea, belongs to Interpol. That's a big part of the issue right there. It's Interpol's membership. The second is really paradoxical. Interpol's own rules require Interpol to publish a red notice when one of its member nations asks for it, unless Interpol has a really good reason to think that that request is abusive. And Interpol, contrary to what you saw in Red Notice and contrary to what Hollywood always tells you, Interpol doesn't have any super secret special sources of information. It just has the data that its member nations supply to it. So very often, Interpol will have no reason in its files to deny a nation's request for a red notice. So Interpol is then obliged under its rules to publish. So ironically, one of the reasons there's a lot of Interpol abuse is not that Interpol is breaking its rules, it's that Interpol is following its rules that require it to publish unless it knows it shouldn't. That's a difficult problem to deal with, although there are ways I think the situation could be improved. What can we do about the problem? Well, there are a lot of domestic measures we can take. I'd like to compliment Representative Pfluger of Texas, who's chair of the House Committee on Homeland Security's Subcommittee on Counterterrorism and Intelligence, for his relatively recently reintroduced legislation on this subject. His colleagues on the subcommittee, Representative Evans of Colorado and Representative Magazine of Rhode Island, have contributed their own bills. All three of these are serious and substantial pieces of legislation that have passed markup and have gone to full committee. But I want to really end by talking about two of the recommendations that I make in my report. First, the United States should have an ombudsman at the part of the US government that is responsible for relations with Interpol. It's called the National Central Bureau, the NCB. And we should have an ombudsman there whose job is to take Interpol abuse and reports of Interpol abuse seriously, to relay our concerns to Interpol and to feed those concerns into the rest of the US government. All of this, by the way, is completely compatible with Interpol's rules. There is no bar whatsoever within the Interpol system for us doing this. Secondly, the United States and other democratic member nations of Interpol should try their best to get a member nation of Interpol who is extremely abusive suspended from Interpol. I have no illusions about how incredibly difficult this is going to be. It is going to be very difficult. But I'm convinced that Interpol needs to establish deterrent power against abuse. Because as long as abuse is very easy to commit and has no consequences for the abusing nation, abuse is liable to continue. Suspending an abusive member nation would make it clear to other member nations that abuse actually has consequences, and therefore other nations will be less likely to commit abuse going forward. Until abuse carries a price, it's likely to continue. And I really think it's in the interests of the United States and in the interests of Interpol itself that we do our best to try to reduce the amount of abuse within the Interpol system. Thanks, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ted, for those comments. Basma, I want to turn it to you for some opening statements. Can you hear us, Basma?
Hello?
Yeah. Just some opening statements from you.
First, thank you all for inviting me and having me today in this discussion, and thanks for institute for its offered on transnational repression. I'm part of a global community of journalists, writers, and activists who are harassed and threatened simply for who they are or what represents. Many are left alone, suffering in silence, because states fail to act to uphold the rule of law and respect their international obligations. My name is Basma Mostafa, and I'm an Egyptian journalist living in exile in Berlin. I was arrested 3 times in Egypt because of my journalistic work exposing human rights abuse. I was forced into exile in November 2020 and began a 9 months journey across different countries where I immediately faced transnational repression, including airport integration, and my family being held in Turkey, surveillance in my hotel in Nairobi, and an attempt to intimidate and detain me in Nairobi airport while I was leaving their side. All of this long before I arrived in Berlin in June 2021, where I thought I would finally find safety for myself and my children. But the repression continued. In July 2022, the Egyptian president official visit to attend a press conference with former Chancellor Olaf Scholz. I tried to register myself as a journalist to attend this conference, but was denied access. Then I joined a peaceful protest in front of the German government building, demanding the release of Egyptian prisoners. When I began to read my statement, I found myself surrounded by 2 men shouting, "Long live Egypt, long live Sisi." One of them slapped me on the face. It has turned into a nightmare. I was threatened with my home address and my children's safety, and faced an online campaign calling for further violence. They said she should have been slapped 7 more times. She should have been raped instead of stabbed. She should die. She is a traitor, a spy, a terrorist. I have been under surveillance for years by people acting on behalf of the Egyptian embassy in Berlin, including a former embassy staff member who has diplomatic immunity. It didn't stop in Berlin also. Last year, during an advocacy mission with the UN in Geneva, a man approached me inside my hotel telling me he is an officer and could arrest me immediately. Of course, he could not officially arrest me, but he could abduct me. Such threat must be taken seriously. My case has been officially recognized by the UN and by the German government itself. Yet, despite these acknowledgements, no one was held accountable. Empty acknowledgements without consequences only embolden perpetrators and send a dangerous message that they can act with impunity because the interests of states will always matter more than human rights and the rule of law. Let me tell you about the psychological impact of this. It means waking up every day expecting to be attacked or threatened. It means wondering if you are safe in your own home or not. It means having to be your own advocate and your own police, looking over your shoulder every single day because no one else will do it for you. You are completely alone in this. Yet despite these personal costs, they continue to fail us. We must examine how global power, like the US, presents themselves as a leader in combating transnational repression, while enable it through foreign policy and selective human rights approach. Real leadership demands self-reflection, while the discussion often focuses on China and Russia. Many regimes, including close allies like in Bromund and in Egypt, are actively these activities. This is a network of power and silence. Breaking it requires courage, solidarity, and willingness to convert and reform one's own policies and alliances. We are exhausted, and we don't need you to admire our resilience. We need concrete measures to prevent this violence before it's happened, including legal framework, independent investigation, real protective measures, and strong accountability mechanism, as highlighted in the recommendation of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you very much for that very powerful testimony, Basma. Elise, just a little bit of your sort of opening statements.
Sure, yeah, I'll try to keep this somewhat short and kind of zoom out and speak in a more general sort of way about TNR, this portfolio we're working on here at New Lines. So transnational repression, I have been working on the issue mainly from the perspective of working with PRC origin diaspora groups. So Uyghurs primarily, but also to an extent some Tibetan organizations, individuals, et cetera, who are experiencing transnational repression and reporting things very similar to the powerful testimony that you heard Basma just give right now. So I've been involved right in that, I guess we could call it a kind of experiential way, and trying to do programs with people to support advocacy, to support diasporas and exiles using their own voices to advocate with their host governments for change. I'm increasingly through this work becoming a little more involved in the research and policy sides of it. And I'll say that one thing I reflect on somewhat often is that it feels like, at least in the DC space, since I feel like I'm living and breathing transnational repression as a topic these days, that it's a term that's getting used quite a bit in this space that we're in here in DC, sometimes in a way that is so broad as to cease to be useful. And there is a point about definitions, right, that a lot of people keep coming back to in writing, talking, thinking about TNR. So I do want to mention it and put it, right here, out here on the table today. There is no one definition. There's certainly not one by the US government, and we're here to talk about the US and what it can do in response to this issue today. The FBI, however, does have a pretty solid operating definition that they use, published on their own website, saying that it is, quote, when foreign governments reach beyond their borders to intimidate, silence, coerce, harass, or harm members of their diaspora and exile communities. Freedom House, right, has a pretty short and very succinct and to the point definition about transnational repression being when governments reach across borders into silence, intimidate, harass diasporas and exiles. At New Lines, we have formulated a definition, not wholly dissimilar, but it adds to it many of the things that qualify, right, as transnational repression. So what are the methods that these states, generally authoritarian and autocratic, how do they do it, right? They might do digital TNR, so harassing people by text message, online, intimidation campaigns that happen online. There's also physical TNR, right? Detention, attempted assassinations, right, are some of the more extreme examples. But in some ways, right, the lack of a common definition, no government, it's not just the United States, there's no government that has actually adopted a definition of transnational repression. And so you will see sometimes in Canada, transnational repression gets lumped together with discussions on foreign interference, which I would say that transnational repression is a form of foreign interference, but not all foreign interference is transnational repression, right? And so as different governments beyond the United States as well are looking to address this issue, this point about definitions and what TNR is and isn't, right, is an important one. And it's one we can maybe, I don't have time to, speak at even more length about it, but we could come back to this in the Q&A if you're interested to hear more. And in the DC space, and just in general, I think a lot of people focus on China. You also heard Basma say this just now. China, 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 and to an extent Russia. But there are other major perpetrators of transnational repression, including some you might not think of. So we have China and Russia, but we also have Tajikistan, right, among the top perpetrators in the world. Relatively small country, right? Turkey, Egypt, Cambodia, the list goes on and on. Freedom House and their really excellent research has noted dozens of states that are really actively perpetrating this. And there's a host of reasons why it's happening, right? I mean, central to the definitions that many of us have of TNR, it's happening because states want to control the narrative, right, about human rights, about rights and freedom and how they treat their own people, even when they're abroad. They want to stifle dissent and criticism. But it's another way to answer why this is happening is because migration and movement around the world is really great, and digital technologies, right, and the connectivity make it, I think, easier than it ever has been to perpetrate transnational repression. So those are just a few opening thoughts. I hope there's some things we could come back to in the Q&A.
Thank you all of you for those opening statements. Quite powerful testimony. So we're gonna, I think, move into a little bit of the discussion phase here. I want to start with you, Ted. Your report, specifically looking at the U.S. government response to transnational repression, was honestly quite critical of what I think could be characterized as inaction from various levels of the U.S. government. If you could point to, let's say, two of the most serious examples of failures from the U.S. government on transnational repression, and what do you think the consequent effect on America's ability to lead on this issue is from those?
Sure. It's a really good question. Overall, in our co-written report on TNR, the big criticisms that we made are that the executive branch, to the extent that it's done good things, and it has sometimes done good things, has largely done them without much cooperation with Congress. And Congress, to the extent that it has done good things, and it sometimes has done good things, has not really succeeded in holding the executive branch to account when the executive branch hasn't lived up to what it's supposed to do. So kind of a failure of what the British, I guess, would call joined up government. But let me get down from sort of the general level and talk about two really specific things. I'm going to focus on the executive branch here for my two big failings. First, the Trump administration's gutting of State Department reporting on this issue is incredibly damaging, and its elimination of funding through state and USAID to Freedom House, which supported a lot of Freedom House's excellent work on this subject. Both of those are incredibly damaging. It's particularly ironic that the Trump administration has gutted State Department reporting because it was the first Trump administration that started the reporting from the State Department in the first place. So it was their own idea that they're now, and a good idea, which I credited them for at the time, which they're now getting rid of. State Department reporting, Lord knows, has its issues. It's not perfect. It's not meant to be comprehensive. State only reports on things that are publicly known, so it can never be comprehensive. But it was, and it would have remained, a very valuable resource in all sorts of ways. So those are huge errors. Second, to keep this bipartisan, the Biden administration's resistance to putting reporting and strategy making into law, the Biden administration fought like crazy to water down the legislation that was eventually passed in the federal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act on Interpol abuse. And then when that was actually passed into law, the Biden administration then refused to follow the law and wouldn't issue the reports that were mandated under law, saying, and I quote this in the report, saying, "We don't think this reporting is a good idea, so we're not going to do it." And Congress, as I'm afraid is all too common, simply ignored the fact the administration was refusing to follow the law. And then finally, one more thing from the Biden administration, they published a generally pretty good ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement directive on the use of Interpol documents, primarily red notices, in immigration cases. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. But from my own work as an expert witness, I'm not really convinced this directive ever made it down into the field or made a whole lot of difference in how ICE actually did anything. So while I'll give the Biden administration credit for frequently talking a pretty good game, when it came to implementing, it wasn't nearly as satisfactory.
Thanks for that, Ted. I want to keep on Interpol for just a second. You also produced a report on Interpol abuse. And in that report, I think you similarly highlight that Interpol needs some changes, perhaps even structurally, to truly minimize abuse. Do you think that, sort of bringing the U.S. into this, do you think the lack of an adequate domestic response from the United States kind of impacts the United States' ability to affect change in Interpol or even collaborate with other countries to institute change?
Boy, that's a really good question. An adequate domestic response to TNR would come from an administration and a Congress that took the issue seriously. And an administration and a Congress like that would probably also be one that would focus on Interpol reform. So yeah, there is kind of a shared mindset or mentality on these issues that would be very helpful, could be very helpful. But the basic reason the United States and other democracies have supported good Interpol reforms in the past, and the U.S. under many administrations, this is a bipartisan issue, and other democracies. The reason why we've done some good things or opposed some bad changes is because the U.S. and other democratic governments were worried about Interpol becoming discredited. Because all these governments rely on Interpol a lot. They use it, and I don't think they abuse it. So support for Interpol reform from the democracies has really been about enlightened self-interest in using Interpol and preserving it, not really coming as a result of concerns about TNR. And then, the reason why the U.S. and a few other democracies can make a big difference in Interpol is not because we have good policies on TNR, although I think we should have better policies on TNR. It's because the U.S. and a few other countries provides Interpol the majority of its budget and most of its operational expertise. The U.S. pays 20% of Interpol's budget, and you throw in a few other democracies, the big ones, and we're over 50%. So the basic barrier to Interpol reform isn't our domestic policies on TNR, no matter how good or bad those are. The barriers are that a lot of Interpol member nations don't want anything that I would call reform, because they like an abusive system just fine, the way it currently works. B, Interpol doesn't really want to do anything to upset a lot of its member nations, because it likes being a universal membership organization. Third, Interpol tends to be run by and for cops who are not happy with the idea of changing Interpol in ways that make it less immediately effective for them. And fourth, honestly, a lack of publicity and coverage, both of the good things that Interpol does, and it does do a lot of good things, and of the opportunities and need for reform. So I think changes to TNR policy are really important, but even if the U.S. had just its current policies on TNR, we and other democracies could, I think, should do a lot in Interpol.
And thank you for pointing that out. Basma, I want to move over to you for a moment. As you, I think, very powerfully said in your opening statements, you have often been the target from people who want to see you and your work silenced. You currently live in Germany, where some of this abuse has occurred. Where do you think Western governments as a whole have failed in regards to their ability to stop transnational repression against you and against others?
Thank you for the question. I believe Western government Transnational Repression is just another right? And for me, they behave like be honest, like NGO with more real power beyond the realistic have no real impacts, and this might help to build image, but
Sorry, Basma, you're breaking up a little bit.
many regimes like no?
Sorry, you're just breaking up a little bit. Could you maybe?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, we can hear you. Can you just maybe start from the beginning of your sentence there?
Maybe turn off your camera as well so that we can.
No?
Basma, yeah,
I can turn the camera.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of, I guess, recap a little bit of what you just said for the audience here.
Yeah, so a regime like those in Egypt and the Gulf actually don't care about their image. What they care about it is economic time, military cooperation, diplomatic support. And when they see no sanction, no frozen asset, no visa bans, they know they can continue without paying any price. And in my case, we know exactly who attacked me, we know where they moved, we know their name, we know everything about them, and they still free, and they feel untouchable. So states need to build real accountability. This is mean creating legal consequences, financial penalties, travel restriction, and public exposure. So when perpetrators realize they risk losing economic deals or freedom of movement, they will. So Western government also failed by supporting and arming our very regime that forced us security and trade partnership with this government, and while ignoring the repression happening beyond the border. So for me, combating transnational repression means to be beyond statements and taking about this system and this network allow this attack. So this is me holding both enemy and allies accountable, real accountable, and being brave enough to change the policies that put power and profit above human rights and the rule of law.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. I think you hit on some pretty important topics there. Elise, as you kind of mentioned in your opening statements, actors like China and Russia take up a lot of the air when it comes to discussing actors who commit transnational oppression. As Basma here has, I think, quite eloquently said and shown, is we're now seeing increasingly small and medium-sized countries, as we would describe them, engaging in the same kind of behaviors that we would account for China, Russia, Iran. How do you think that that impacts the approach the United States should take in combating transnational oppression?
I mean, I think on some sort of practical level, it means that like we need to just recognize and admit, right? Like that it's happening, because sometimes you'll go and you might be talking to somebody in Congress, whatever, and they're really just interested in what China is doing. And I say that because I've had this experience personally, right? As though these other states aren't also doing this same thing, and we miss the kind of full picture of what's happening. We also miss the way that the states are like learning from one another, and adapting, and adopting sort of new techniques, new methods, new ways of repressing like their nationals, right? Wherever they are living around the world, and so I just think we don't have a complete or consistent picture. And when we're talking about something like, right, like Basma has said several times, my co-panelist here, putting sort of economic, political, and other concerns over human rights, if we do want to get it back to that rights-focused perspective, which is really at the heart of transnational repression and what it does to people, then I think, consistently calling out, right? like these different countries that are committing this within the borders of the United States would be really important. I understand there are all sorts of diplomatic and political and other challenges that end up getting in the way of that. But if you're coming at it from a human rights perspective and wanting consistency and centering the people who are targets of transnational repression, then I think that ends up being very disappointing.
Thank you. So, Basma, I have another question for you. Obviously, if the United States is going to lead on sort of the global effort of combating transnational repression, it's important to have close coordination with our allies. The United States and European countries, we collaborate on many issues from economic to security to political. What is sort of the European perspective on the US's role and perhaps leadership in combating transnational repression globally?
Okay, first I want to clarify that I don't speak for Europe as a whole. I speak as an exiled journalist and a human rights defender living in Europe who has experienced transnational repression directly firsthand. And for me, when we talk about Europe's perspective on the US role, it's important to recognize that both the US and Europe share similar size or similar contradiction for me. So the US often can present itself as a global leader on human rights, but this leadership is highly selective. While it strongly condemns some dictatorship regime, it's continued to support or tolerate with others, especially strategic allies, which seriously undermines its credibility. And in Europe, there has been increasing recognition of transnational repression as a threat. Small steps, tiny steps, like including transnational repression on the new government agreements in Germany, or for example, adopting the sanction framework. This is really important, but it still remains, for me, as one who experienced this at first hand, symbolic steps, and there are a lot of law real enforcement. So for both US and the EU, Europe, security and economic interests still override human rights commitment in practice. And for me, true leadership means comforting not only the enemy but also the allies, and creating real consequences through legal accountability, economic measure, strong protection system for exiled defenders. And so my descriptive addressing transnational repression against it requires deep self-reflection and willing to comfort transnational repression. And we need both the US to move from statement to concrete action. This is including detecting before the attack, before the harm happens, holding perpetrators accountable, no matter who they are, and creating real consequences so that transnational repression is no longer zero-cost strategy for dictatorship regime.
Thank you for that, Basma. Thank you for that. So I want to open it up to the audience now for any questions you have for our panelists. Yes, sir. If you just give your name and affiliation and then your question.
I teach in IR. Some of the things that I'm increasingly getting interested in is issues of so-called terrorism. And I was just curious about a couple of things here. Like, first of all, I had the impression that there was a certain assumption, which is like we live in democracies and there are non-democracies. But just to problematize this a bit more, and I'm sure we're all aware of that, there is a huge climate among the values and the qualities of democracy throughout the world, including in the Western Hemisphere. So I'm wondering how do we then conceptualize the question of national repression and TNR. And I'll just give maybe a very specific example in order to highlight like where I want to get to. In the aftermath of October 7th, there were examples where Germany expelled people with US American citizenship for their pro-Palestinian stance, does not allow them to return back within the next 4 or 5 years. Now, I don't know what that means in terms of how then domestic police institutions like the FBI then potentially surveil these people or whatever. But I'm just curious, like when we speak about allyship, and I had the impression that when we spoke about the United States and its allies, we were primarily referring to, or you were primarily referring to other democracies. Now, clearly, there is this problem occurring that there is an increasing authoritarianism within democracies. And then there is this problem that a lot of the allies are deeply authoritarian regimes, who themselves have like different designations of who's a terrorist and not. And again, what does that imply? Because we have different legal frameworks in different nation states, how does that then translate in what does Interpol offer in terms of making sure to protect people from their rights rather than following through the whims and wishes of some other authoritarian regimes who have a lot of money and other interests, which they can buy their own, whatever is at stake for them in other countries. So how do we conceptualize the question of national repression and TNR at the backdrop of this increasing authoritarian wave that is going throughout the Western Hemisphere and the decline of democracy?
You guys want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at a couple aspects of it. It's an academic fixation, and I say this as an academic myself, that academics love to problematize things and say that democracies are problematic and that the definition of authoritarian or democracy is problematic. I think attitudes like that are a significant problem. We know what democracies are, we know what autocracies are, and I'm not interested in engaging on an argument about whether or not a democracy is perfect. I know where I would prefer to live, and I suspect that you know where you would prefer to live. So I don't think that discussions like that are terribly relevant to these sorts of questions. But you do raise some important points. One is that Interpol really can't do anything, and I wouldn't want it to do anything, to defend rights in any country in the world. It's not its job. Interpol has a very narrow mandate. It is essentially to serve as a bulletin board for police around the world to put their notices up on, and other countries can read those notices or they can ignore those notices. Interpol is not a rights-protecting body, and I think it would be extremely destructive for Interpol if it tried to be a rights-protecting body, because it means that everyone would quit. And I don't think that would be advantageous at all. At its very bottom, and Interpol will never say this, but at its very bottom, Interpol is a manifestation of the obligation that all civilized nations have in a system, an international system, based on sovereign nation states, that we don't harbor each other as fugitives. You could call this sort of a principle of being a good neighbor.
Now, the assumption in that, of course, is that the individuals are justly accused of something that is widely recognized as a genuine offense. That's where the challenge comes in. How much credibility do we want to give to accusations made through Interpol by another member nation? If the accusation is coming from Germany or Japan or Australia, well, I'm liable to say, yeah, we probably should give that a fair amount of credibility. If it comes from the PRC or Tajikistan or Rwanda, which you haven't mentioned, which deserves a mention here as a not particularly great place, I've been liable to give it a great deal less credibility. And that really is the challenge of Interpol when you put it into sort of an international relations context. Sovereignty is a really important principle for the organization of the international state system, and Interpol is explicitly based on state sovereignty. But the presumption of innocence is also a really important principle in criminal justice. I would argue it's the most important principle in the Western system of criminal justice. The problem is that sovereignty and the presumption of innocence at the international level are not fully compatible. Because if you respect the sovereignty of another nation that makes an accusation, you should give the accused criminal up. But that person might be innocent, and they deserve the presumption of innocence. Those two things are both right. They are both really valuable. They both need to be preserved, but they are both not fully compatible with each other. And that's the real challenge in an international relations context of having an international organization like Interpol that deals with criminal justice. How do you defend both the sovereignty of democratic nation states and the belief that individuals are innocent until proven guilty? It's really challenging.
Thank you. Elise, or Basma, do you have
Basma has a response sheet.
any comment on that question? We'll give it.
I'll just say to bring things, like one way of answering this question, to bring things back to the point about definitions that I raised in my opening comments, is I can't think of a single definition of DNR that actually explicitly spells out that it has to be an autocratic or authoritarian state. It's describing something that in theory, right, any state could commit or could perpetrate. I mean, I think what we're reflecting on here is what the trends show that it generally has been, right, autocratic states. And I don't think that, I think you can admit, right, that there is this global shift happening, but at the same time, these terms that we're using here, right, are still useful, and they still mean something. This is just one way. I don't think any of the definitions present us with something that's super problematic. Some people might say that the United States' pursuit of Edward Snowden, right? I've heard some people refer to the United States' pursuit of Edward Snowden as is this the United States perpetrating TNR, right? And maybe that's an academic discussion to have, but the definitions don't preclude it.
It's interesting that the Snowden case falls outside Interpol because whatever crime he committed, it's not an ordinary law crime. So Interpol is not relevant. Interpol is not allowed to pursue, among other things, military offenses. So war crimes, for example, are generally, there is one sort of out on this, but are generally cannot be subject to Interpol red notices. The point I want to make about autocracies and democracies, there is one example, there may be others, but there's one that really leads to mind. India is committing an increasing amount of TNR.
Yes.
And I would regard India as a reasonably democratic state. But India is rising up the charts as a perpetrator of TNR. I'm not sure, it's very difficult to sort of rank, who commits the most because most TNR goes unreported. But India is committing more, and that is an interesting harbinger, perhaps for other nations, or perhaps it just says something about India, or perhaps it's a little bit of both. Pains me to say that, but I'm afraid it is true.
Basma, I just wanted to give you a moment if you had any comments on the question or any of the discussion here before we perhaps move on.
Sorry, Charles, the connection,
Okay.
there is a delay. Can you like say what you say it again?
Yeah. Did you hear the original question? If not, I can kind of summarize it, I think, a little bit for you.
In the last part, like 10 minutes, I didn't hear well
Okay.
because I don't know what's happening with my internet, like some delay. So if you can
That's,
summarize or write in the chat, I don't know.
yeah, I think that the nature of the question is how do we kind of deal with and understand domestic repression as well as transnational repression, maybe in the context of countries we would consider democracies committing it or being complicit in it.
Yes, for me, confronting transnational repression in host state is really requires the courage to look into there is an interaction between domestic policies inside the host states, transnational repression. So to confront transnational repression, host state need also to look into their policies and make reform for it.
Thank you. I think we have time for perhaps one more question. Is there anybody out there who would like to ask something? Yes, Susanna.
Hi, my name is Susanna. I actually also work at New Lines Institute, and I work on mass atrocities, so the concept of the definitional issue has been really interesting to me. There's obviously famously terrorism and extremism suffer from similar problems. I was wondering if, in terms of terrorism, it's obviously heavily politicized, and that's why, to a certain extent, transnational bodies and other countries have not agreed on definitions. Is TNR similar to this, and would having a definition help you, or what do you think is the best strategy from there?
I have some thoughts, but do you want to respond as well?
I have a couple thoughts, but you go first. It was
Okay,
mostly
since I
your
invoked
issue.
it. Yeah. I wouldn't say it's nearly as politicized. And I think that when it comes down to the point of definitions, I think the important thing is for individual states to have definitions, because as has already been coming up, right, with different systems, different laws, different policies, different mechanisms that already exist in the different places, there is going to be a need for definitions that are adapted to national contexts. I just don't know that there's a way to have one overarching definition.
Yeah, no, I think I certainly agree with that. One issue that comes up definitionally, and it's a challenge that's facing some of the current legislation on the Hill, is that different diaspora communities in the United States want to criticize each other for things that are going on either within an individual foreign country or in a foreign region. Criticizing someone is not repressing them. I realize that, we're all super sensitive on speech today, except I'm not. But criticizing someone is not repression, and it's certainly not transnational repression. And one of the big issues that we're seeing on the Hill now is that some of this legislation is meeting some challenges because of concerns that defining something
trying to define TNR in legislation will end up criminalizing one individual's ability to criticize, I have a view about country X, and person, someone else from that country criticizes my view about it. That's not transnational repression. You may not like the criticism, you may disagree with it, but it's certainly not TNR, and it absolutely should not be criminalized by the government. So finding a way in law to make it clear that within the United States, TNR does not involve criticizing someone, it involves acting as an agent of a foreign government. That's that's where the definitional problem becomes really real. That's going to be hard enough to do within the United States. Coming up with something in law that would cover, even 2 countries, never mind 40 or 50, would be inconceivably challenging. And I think it would be very unwise to try to start down that road. It's tough enough to do in the U.S. I think we should just focus country by country.
And there's an issue as well, right, which is, I was kind of hinting at it and not getting to it in my opening remarks, but one of the big definitional problems that comes up is that some people say that transnational repression can be committed against anyone. So like I, as someone who might be, I say might be, like my work directly deals with the PRC. It criticizes it in a lot of ways. I work with people who criticize it. I have been, targeted in like digital campaigns and such by the PRC. Am I experiencing transnational repression? I don't see that I am. I am not a national. PRC has no claim on me, right, as their national. Never has and never will. But there are definitions, including one posited by folks on the UN level recently, that just say that anybody, so TNR might be committed when a state wants to harass or intimidate or silence anyone who is like doing work about that state or critiquing it, right? And that ends up kind of mattering too, right?
Yeah.
So.
Cool. Unfortunately, I think we're up at time right now.
Always goes so quickly.
Yeah. I want to thank all the panelists for being here, especially Basma for speaking quite openly about the experiences you've had personally. I think this has been a very timely and important conversation, as I said in the beginning, and I hope the audience enjoyed it too. Thank you, everybody. I believe our panelists will be available for a little bit afterwards. If anyone wants to get in contact with Basma, I can help facilitate that. So, thank you, everybody.